When we talk about structural racism, oftentimes people are like, what does that mean? And I think that they shape the personal agency and how people can come together as groups to get what they want. And so there's a lot of ways that organizations constrain agency. I think our ability to act on the world, to create, to learn, express emotion, are all shaped by our participation in organizations. I also, in my sort of more formal theory, move on from saying organizations are racial structures to talk about exactly how organizations shape people's agency, right? And so one of the ways they do it is through resource distribution, right, within organizations and then to individuals in organizations. I also argue that whiteness is often an unstated credential in organizations that gets people access to jobs and resources. And finally, that rules in organizations, formal rules, are often applied in ways that are racially biased. So one of the ways that I argue that organizations shape agency is by controlling people's time use. Where one is located in the hierarchy of an organization influences how much control they have over their time. Their ability to plan non-work time outside of the organization, and the ability to plan for their future, both for themselves and for their kids. So segregation or incorporation into the lower tiers of organizations makes it harder for one to influence organizational procedures, and I think, you know, how someone who is a racialized subordinate at work, or in school or at church, it shapes their ability to influence what the organization does and the direction of the organization. Deference rituals are also built into work hierarchies, shaping the ability to act within socially prescribed roles. So organizations shape habitual actions as employees are expected to defer to customers, employers, or the public. And they also shape and constrain people of color's range of emotional expressions. So we can think about this in terms of, you know, some of the poetry we saw in the last session when people were like describing their inability to actually state what was happening to them. I also think organizations shape agency through what amounts to the theft of time from non-whites. So we can think about this in a whole bunch of ways. One is differential wages for the same work, or the concentration of non-whites at the bottom of organizational hierarchies means it takes more labor time to purchase the same amount of goods outside of work. Hiring discrimination means it takes more time to find a job, and thus all of these shape people's ability to plan their future. Organizations also legitimate the unequal distribution of resources. So segregation, by design, limits access to resources. And I think racial segregation is a foundational characteristic of most organizations. It's enforced through custom, policy, and historically through law. Segregation between organizations is typically a means that is used to maintain organizations that have large proportions of people of color under-resourced, right? So we can think of the history of segregated schooling or HBCUs having vastly different resources relative to historically white colleges and universities. You can also think of, this became clear during the coronavirus pandemic, the relative failure rate of black businesses relative to white businesses because they lack the resources to weather downturns. Finally, we can also think about how occupational segregation structures racial organizations, right? So despite decades of anti-discrimination and corporate diversity policy, racial change at the top of corporate hierarchies can still be measured in tenths of a percentage point changes, with people of color firmly positioned at the base of the pyramid. In Fortune 500 companies, blacks make up just 1% of CEOs and Latinos less than 2%. The final part of my theory is arguing that whiteness is a credential that provides access to resources, it legitimates the work hierarchy, and it provides, you know, a greater range of agency. So sociologists, when they describe credentials, the idea is that credentials are sort of race-neutral characteristics that one earns that then allow one access to jobs or, you know, education. But there's these audit studies that sociologists do, and what these are is they usually send equally matched black and white folks out to apply for jobs or look for housing. And there's a really famous one that a sociologist named Diva Pager did, in which she sent black and white men out claiming they had a criminal record or not to apply for jobs. And she found in this survey that white men with criminal records were more likely to be called back for entry-level jobs than black men who had never served time. And she conceptualizes this as she calls the criminal record a negative credential. So I reframe her research and say that actually what's the negative credential there is blackness, because white men with criminal records were actually being called back more than black men who had never served time. And so I say that whiteness serves as an organizational credential, right? And then my final point is about how organizations use rules. And in sociology, the term for this is decoupling. The idea is basically there's a formal set of rules that we all know organizations subscribe to, and then there's the informal practices that either conform to or go against those rules. And I think this decoupling happens in a whole bunch of ways, but I think organizational rules designed to protect people of color from discrimination are routinely broken. And that organizations are also likely to apply rules differently based on the race of a rule breaker, right? So if a white employee violates a rule versus a person of color violating the same rule. And I think that a lot of times these decoupling policies, or these policies that folks say, well, we have a diversity program. They're designed actually to placate external constituencies outside of the organization, but they don't actually change the racialized relations inside the organization all that much. So I'm going to leave it there for now. And
Great to be here. My name is TJ Dudo-Norris. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Iowa. This is my 6th academic year here at this institution. I started my time here as a Grant Wood Fellow, intended to be here for 1 year. Really loved Iowa and was going to apply for a PhD. But then a tenure track position opened. I applied for it, got the job. Here I am. So what's going to be playing up here silently is a film called A Eulogy by Tamika. So my birth name is Tamika Janine Norris. The main medium of my work is institutional critique. I started my, in quotes, academic career in community college at Santa Monica College in Santa Monica, California. I spent 5 long years at community college. I failed painting 3 times, like with an F. And that was during Hurricane Katrina 2005. And the teachers were like, you're just not doing it right. You're not making dimension. You're not doing it right. I was not born with the innate skill to make dimension. It's also just not something that I was interested in. I had a black mentor who encouraged me after 5 years to apply to transfer to a university, to a state school. The white counselors advised UC Irvine, UC Riverside, start small. My black mentor said, shoot your shot, apply for UCLA. So after failing painting 3 times with work that I made with grief on the floor in my apartment, watching my childhood home disappear, Pastor-Shan, Mississippi, Gulfport, Mississippi, Biloxi, Mississippi, parts of New Orleans, I was accepted to UCLA where I got my BA. While I was there, I was encouraged to apply for an MFA. And again, they were like, well, just go around the corner to UC Irvine. Again, black mentor, shoot your shot. I applied to Yale and I got in. So I went to Yale for my MFA in painting after failing painting 3 times in community college. And I wish the students were here because I wanted to tell my first arrest story. So the first time I was arrested, I was 18 years old and I was the victim of an assault. I was illegally arrested because they wanted to make sure that they could make charges stick on the black man, that they wanted to make sure charges were pressed against him. It was an illegal arrest because I was held on a bench warrant and held in jail for 2 weeks to assure that I testified against this man. So prostitutes got out of jail before I did. People that committed much more serious crimes got out of jail before I did. Then I was a part of a class action suit that offered me $11 per day that I was incarcerated illegally. So I ended up with a check for about $200 that I wished I did not have to cash. And it's funny, but it's not funny. To this day, I really wish I didn't have to cash that check, but I needed the money that bad. So fast forward, when I moved here, I was like, I love Iowa. The ease here. I saw the new art building and was like, I never want to leave. I was told that it was career suicide to, have degrees from UCLA and Yale and show my work internationally. I had a solo show at the Figge Museum last year. I have a solo show up right now at Illinois State University. My work's been collected by the Figge Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem. I've gotten 2 NEA grants. I got the Pollock-Krasner grant last year or 2 years ago, the Jackson Pollock-Krasner grant, which is a $20,000 fellowship to produce work. This pandemic has been really interesting, and I think it really speaks to the experience of being, a young professor at a university. So I purchased my first home as Tamika in Cedar Rapids, and hence the legal abbreviation, feeling like to feel safe, I have to show up as an abbreviated version of myself. I cannot be my whole self in any space. So also I had students tell me straight out, we weren't enrolling for your class because the name Tamika sounded ghetto. We were afraid that we were going to be held responsible for content we didn't want to be held responsible for in a class that was just supposed to be painting. So the nature of my work being institutional critique, and buying my first house and the issues that I had buying a house as Tamika, then becoming TJ Dido Norris, taking on my mother's maiden name, French Creole name. Very different read. Gender, socioeconomic status, race is not all easily legible through my now name. Same kids that didn't want to enroll in my class as Tamika then enrolled as TJ and didn't know that I was the same person, which is interesting. So purchased a couple houses in Cedar Rapids, so I was a victim of the derecho, which gave me all sorts of post-Katrina flashbacks. And the work that you're kind of seeing here is a film that I made at the Figge Museum in my solo show. So my grandmother died in August, who was more of my mother during COVID. No funeral in Mississippi, I couldn't go. I've never grieved, and I've never grieved alone. Also a part of this pandemic experience was a divorce. I married a German man in Germany. I spent a lot of time as an artist in Germany, brought him here, and the civil unrest piece and just the cultural difference piece that I thought, it's 2020, that's not a thing anymore. It was just too much, and my partner did not sign up for what also became me taking power of attorney of my mother while being here, who passed away in August from complications of COVID. Whew. But still, I'm so grateful to my practice, because without these 2 solo shows, I would not have been able to produce the work, which grief is a medium of this work. Institutional critique is a medium of this work. And where this practice has led me now is, what is my legacy? So my practice includes me making my first will. My practice includes me establishing my first estate. What happens to my work as an artist? Who's gonna make this estate besides me? Who's gonna warrant my work more important than I am right now? So my current practice isn't necessarily one of being in a studio, moving a paintbrush like this. I'm working with attorneys who are helping me put together to get my house in order. My mother's house was not in order, and as her eldest child, I was held responsible for things that I don't wish on anybody. For some, it's no critique of my mother, but things were just not in order. And I think it's really interesting too, I've got 2-3 minutes. I'm up for tenure now, and the process is just stressful. And while I was sitting here, I stepped out to take a phone call from a Black colleague here who just called to see how I was doing. And I think it's a testament of what it means to be Black at this institution. I was on a committee meeting yesterday, and he's just like, called me today. There was something in your eyes. You just look like, how you doing? And I just think that was really profound and really powerful. And feeling like I had to use today as well to make my plea to President Wilson, to make my plea to Dean Rowland, to say, I'm up for tenure. And these are the issues that I'm having. These are the concerns that I have about being up for tenure and not feeling exactly supported. I do feel especially supported by you, Professor Dr. Berry. But as you know, it's a very rigorous process, and you're left feeling really isolated and sometimes less than. And I know that my credentials speak. There is no lack of credentials, but the way, it is to feel in a predominantly white space when you're up for tenure, even when maybe my credentials, pardon me, run laps around some of my colleagues, I'm still left feeling as though I might not make it. And I just feel so deeply for the young students that spoke earlier, because I felt that so hard. Being an artist that makes institutional critique means I spent my academic years really butting up against the institution. It is not a sustainable practice. Just like with your bones, you can't just, that cartilage, those joints are gonna wear down. So here we are. I love being here in Iowa. Another testament is that Mayor Bruce is a friend of mine. Like, what are the odds of living in a town where you're friends with the mayor? What are the odds of being deeply in grief and going to Bread Garden and seeing Monica and Mark Moen and then being like, well, you need to move, and having the support of people who own major properties in this city go, let's find you a better place to live. So it's been a profound and complicated and beautiful experience being here. I'm now 25% in African American Studies. I look forward to teaching my first class here in the near future. Thank you. And I've got like 30 seconds left, but that's pretty much the extent of what I wanted to share. Yeah, I think that's it. Oh, okay, yeah, so this film again is called Eulogy, and this is me processing grief in real time of my grandmother. It's also, I had my colleague give a real eulogy to Tamika, who needed to be laid to rest because she's been through too much shit. She's been through too much. So she's had an opportunity to be laid to rest. It doesn't mean that she's dead forever, but she needed to be laid to rest. And so I'm making this work in support with many therapists, and I box hardcore. I'm pretty ripped underneath my fancy clothes here. So I've been boxing and going to lots of therapy to process what it means to be in mostly white spaces, experiencing institutional racism, experiencing grief for the first time ever in my life, to have my mother and my grandmother die within 8 months of one another, and a derecho and a divorce. It's kind of a lot. But I also feel super empowered and super blessed to have my practice. My practice has been a gift. Like, if God, the universe, whatever you believe in, set me up for this moment, it couldn't have been planned more perfectly. That this practice has been the constant. This practice has been the gift that I've had to express and move through. And I've been, thanked or whatever. I know that I've been given the gift to express, and a lot of it does come through performance, and it's raw. And I'm so grateful that it resonates with people. And I think we are in a collective grieving moment right now. And I know that, and I'm just super grateful that institutions and museums lined up opportunities for me to make this work that I've been able to make, because it's really been a part of not just my academic experience, but my healing process. And the last thing that I'll say about the boxing piece, just because it's so fun, that I box at Big George's Boxing Club, and a part of my mission too is, I love that gym, it's really gritty, but there's a lot of young folks of color that go there. It's also the house of the University of Iowa's boxing club. So I'm looking to endow a scholarship personally from my own money to help young kids of color that don't have resources to have their own boxing clubs, or to pay the monthly dues, or to get new boxing shoes if they need them. So it's been such an awesome opportunity. And it's what I call #embodied research. And that's sort of been the next phase of my practice, is really dealing with the embodied parts of my research. So thank you.
My current research is dealing with racialism in the media. And some of you, I know my mother's already heard this before, but she can hear it again. And this is a book that was published in last year in June, and it was my first scholarly book in probably, 7 or 8 years. So I'm really excited about it. I spent probably 20, 25 years kind of working on the research in relation to the images and messages, studying the images and messages of African Americans in the media. And so what I really am trying to do, oh, that's the title, Racialism in the Media, Black Jesus, Black Twitter, and the First Black American President. Basically what I am doing is I came up with a concept that I'm calling racialism. And the importance of this concept is the fact that I want to argue that everything is not racist. Now, I know there's some people who are going to challenge me on that, but this is my concept. Racialism is like an umbrella term. I'm using it like an umbrella term, and it basically involves racial ideas, images, and issues that are produced, distributed, and consumed repetitively and intertextually. Unfortunately, many of the images and ideas, particularly when it comes to African American culture, are stereotypes, or they come in stereotypes, bias frames, and historical myths. And the fourth element of that umbrella is traditional racism. The problem is that these stereotypes and bias frames and historical myths are normalized in a mediated process, and we begin to accept them. Society begins to accept these mediated representations as they're shaped and influenced into certain kinds of ideology and behavior. So like I said, I spent 20 to 25 years. I have a class called African Americans in the Media, and so I played around with a lot of these concepts in relation to my classes. You know, having students kind of look at certain images and think about this concept that I was trying to develop and how it fit in relation to what I wanted to argue, or at least the issues I wanted to bring forward. So here are some examples of what I'm considering racialism versus racism. So this is a stereotype under racialism. And this is, most of you can see, it's a Kool-Aid commercial. And the basic logo is old school flavor. So you can tell that the male and the female are, you know, they're from the old school. And so he's got on hush puppies, and they're sitting on a stoop, and she's drinking some Kool-Aid. And the interesting thing about this, a lot of people wouldn't pay attention, or they wouldn't remember this or think about this, but the interesting thing is, when I stopped to look at it, I said, why is there a basketball under his foot? There's absolutely no reason for a basketball to be under his foot, except that's a stereotype of black men, okay, that they play basketball. Somebody putting this image together said, oh, let's put a basketball under his foot. He's not even wearing tennis shoes. He's wearing hush puppies. He's not on a basketball court. I don't even know if he could play basketball. He doesn't look like he might be a basketball player, but somebody created this stereotype and put it into this image. This is an example of biased framing. What I'm looking at under racialism is biased framing. This comes from one of my favorite stations, and I do watch Fox. I flip back and forth between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox because I like to know what they're talking about. But anyway, when President Obama turned 50, he was our president at the time, and so he had a birthday party at the White House, and this is how that birthday party was labeled in the Fox News. They said Obama's hip-hop barbecue didn't create jobs. So the interesting thing about that is it's the framing, it's a biased frame. First of all, hip-hop in certain kinds of circles, especially circles when it comes to Fox News, is not seen as a positive. Hip-hop is seen as a negative. So calling it a hip-hop barbecue instead of his 50th birthday, bash is problematic. And then saying it didn't create jobs, well, it wasn't supposed to, right? Then the other thing that was interesting about this is they got 4 black men. Now, I know only black men did attend the party, but they got 4 black men because they want to tie it to hip-hop. Yet only one of those black men is attached to hip-hop, and that's Jay-Z at the end. Chris Rock is not a rapper. The president's not a rapper. Charles Barkley is an athlete. He's not a rapper. But the way they framed this situation is biased and problematic. And it leads us, or leads their readers, to think in a certain way about that event, in a certain negative way about that event. And this is an example of historical myth. Historical myth, the way I look at that is there are a lot of negatives tied to African Americans' connection to Africa. That's where historical myths come in. So you have this beautiful fashion shoot. Naomi Campbell is the model who's actually running with the cheetah. And, you know, it's interesting because she has on her cheetah outfit, and they call it, or at least the logo, the brand that they give it is Wild Things. Now, some people would say, well, what's the problem with that? What's the issue? I don't understand. Well, the issue is that when we think about Africa, what do we think about? We think about wild. We think about uncivilized. We think about savage. We think about animalistic. So even though it's a beautiful fashion shoot, it's still tied to some problematic historical myths that are consistent with how people think about Africa. So again, those three elements I just showed you, the stereotype, the bias framing, and the historical myth, I don't really know if I would call them racism, because racism, the way I see it or define it, is intentional. It's malicious. It's something that somebody has purposely created or put together in order to frame or build African American culture from a really problematic or really ugly perspective. Now, this is an example of traditional racism that came out of 2012. This is a bumper sticker when President Obama was running for re-election. The basic thing says what? Don't renege. Now, we know what that's shorthand for. Okay? We know what renege means. Don't put that N word back in office. Okay? And at the bottom, you may not be able to read it, but it says, stop repeat offenders, don't re-elect Obama. Now that's traditional racism. Anything that deals with, you know, KKK, lynching, the N-word, all those kinds of purposeful, malicious, you know, negative kinds of ideas and images, that is traditional racism under my concept of racialism. So here's some more examples that I wanted to show you that I think are interesting. These are kind of twists on the stereotype, two examples of twisting the stereotype. Now we know there's a major stereotype about black women as mammies or maids. So this is interesting because they're twisting that concept of the black woman as a mammy or a maid. She's advertising for Pine Sol, which of course is a cleaning product. But instead of being a typical maid image, she's got on her satin robe, her hair is done, she's got her makeup, and her nails are you know, excellent or well done. So she's beautiful. She's not the typical image of a stereotype of a maid. So it's kind of like taking that stereotype, that notion, and twisting it and giving it more of a positive image. Now some people say, well, she's still advertising a cleaning product. Yeah, but she's being paid for it. She's not working as a maid. She actually advertising a product and looks beautiful, looks good doing it. The other image is, of course, a black man with his child laying on his chest. And we see so many and hear so many negative stereotypes about black men and their kids. So I thought that Tide ad was a beautiful twist on the whole concept of black men and their kids, showing them in a more positive and very, in my opinion, very beautiful image. This is another example, and now some people say this is, matter of fact, this was really the whole racial, there was a lot of people that called this racism. And so I guess on some level it could be, but I also see it as a part of our historical myth, as my historical myth issue. On the cover of Vogue magazine a number of years ago, they took LeBron James and they posed him as this King Kong poster. Okay? He's got his mouth wide open like he's growling. Instead of having a club, he has a basketball and he's holding the white woman in his left arm. Now, there was a lot of controversy, okay, concerning this image. And some people say it's racist, and I've gotten some backlash for this, but I still see it as connected to the image of a historical myth in the sense that black men are constantly called apes. Some of you will remember on the internet, we saw a lot of images of President Obama as an ape or as a monkey. So black men as apes, coming, you know, animalistic, coming out of Africa, all of that is tied to this image. And then I have a couple more examples. This came out of Hurricane Katrina, which TJ talked about. And basically, this was the same news, Yahoo News, had two different articles that came out. On the left side is a white man and a white woman wading through waist-deep water, and on the right side is a black man. And you may not be able to read what that says, but the white man and the white woman are basically said they found food. They found food. The black man in that article, he looted a store. Yeah, he looted and they found. So again, showing how different kinds of words make a difference, in how they look at images. Oh, and that's the last one. So thank you very much.